While Canada emerged from the First World War a victorious nation, proud of its contribution, it was also left damaged and divided. Joining us now for more on what the Great War wrought for Canada is Charlotte Gray, historian and author of, most recently, The Massey Murder, A Maid, Her Master, and the Trial That Shocked a Country. Welcome back to the agenda. How are you?
Fine. Great to be here.
Nice to have you back. You know, we talk a lot about the Great War and its impact in Europe and its impact on Canadians who are over there fighting. We so rarely talk about the impact the Great War had here in Canada, and that's what I want to spend our conversation doing. So, heading into 1914, take us back a century ago, what was our relationship, our being Canada, with Great Britain?
Very, very close. I mean, most English Canadians thought of themselves as being British and thought of themselves as citizens in the last in the larger British Empire. And although there was just the first hint of drawing away, the little bit of air becoming between Canada and Britain, a few indications like Canada not willingly just sending money to Britain to pay for warships, for instance, English Canadians were happy to be British. French Canadians, not so much. French Canadians had a very different relationship with Britain. Nonetheless, that they were happy to be Canadians. But, you know, we're still 50 years, within 50 years from Confederation. So this is a young and precarious country.
And paint a picture for me of Toronto, a city that was influenced by its ties to the Empire. How much influence did the Victorian era have on a city like Toronto?
Toronto was beyond Victorian. I mean, even in 1914, when war breaks out, it was still very old-fashioned, very stuffy, pretty provincial, frankly, and with a very layered class system. You know, with at the top the families known as the fine old Ontario families, many of whom were loyalists and really believed in the monarchy, the empire. But at the bottom of the social class system, there was a whole new group, which were the British working class immigrants who had flooded in after 1900 and were building this city that was going to become so prosperous, so large. And they had a rather different attitude. One of the reasons that they had left Britain in many cases was they want to leave behind the class system. So Toronto's in flux, but nevertheless, it is a city that goes to sleep on Sundays.
And as our country heads off to war, is there this sort of cohesive attitude as we head off, or was it sort of disparate?
Oh, it was absolutely cohesive. The demonstrations in Toronto when war breaks out, the enthusiasm for the war, the sense of defending Christian values in the British Empire, it really united a population. It was a very powerful surge of support for the war effort in 1914.
And here we are, a young country, as you said, 5 decades into being a country. What's our experience in terms of warfare? Are we sort of like, what is this? Or are we like, we're ready to go?
Experience of warfare among the Canadians, not much, frankly. You know, there had been a whole century which had more or less been peaceful. I mean, Britain had had its little wars at the edge of empire, particularly, for example, in South Africa at the turn of the century, and some Canadians had gone to that, but volunteers. And so there was not any experience of war, and there was still a sense that war was a crusade. War was a sort of glorious endeavor, purifying, and it allowed men to show they were really men.
And just paint a picture again, the average soldier, it's, you know, what's he like in terms of a Canadian soldier? Working class?
Likely to be working class, likely to be born in Britain. I told you that many of them were new British immigrants in Toronto, and many of them had, even if they'd been born in Canada, maybe their parents had been born in Britain. So they were, and the other thing about the Canadian soldiers is that they were, in many cases, better fed and stronger than the British soldiers, because one of the most amazing things you can ever see is the health records of British soldiers. How many of them were actually turned down in the first round of enlistment because their health was so bad, they were so malnourished.
And so the working class, you talked about this classless society in Canada. The working class is going off to war. Before conscription, what are the upper elites doing at this time?
They're going to. Very, very strong support for the war. Many of them had been sort of in volunteer forces, and they see it as an opportunity for glory. They're officers. They've all been at university together or in clubs together. And it really is a uniting movement that month, the end of 1914 altogether, a huge enthusiasm. There's an appeal for volunteers, which is oversubscribed. I mean, within a few weeks of war being declared, 21,000 people, 21,000 men are being shipped overseas.
And, you know, we hear letters that the men had written back, but are there a few that sort of can capture, that stories that capture what kinds of stories they were sending home?
Well, for most of the Canadians who went as part of the first expeditionary force in 1914, they actually had a miserable time the first few months because they don't get to France until the following late February, early March, and they are in Salisbury, on the Salisbury Plain in Britain, and it rains absolutely solidly. It rains, and they are cold, and they're wet, and the British officers who are trying to teach them how to be soldiers get furious because all they do is go to the pubs. But nonetheless, you know, the sort of esprit de corps is still there.
We talked about Canadian attitudes towards Great Britain as we head into the war, and, you know, the sort of loyalty and looking up to, and we are part of you. What are our attitudes towards Germany at the time?
Demonizing. One of the aspects of the war, which it took a while for sort of historians to really investigate, but the propaganda machine in Britain was incredibly effective in terms of spreading horrendous stories about what the Germans had done when they marched into Belgium. And all those stories about bayoneted babies and raped nuns were all repeated. You can see them all on the front page of the Toronto newspapers too. So the attitude to Germany was, Germans are brutes. Germans are beyond the pale. And it plays back into this sort of idea that this is a crusade, good against evil.
And so as this is happening, say on the front pages of the Toronto newspapers, there are German Canadians here at the time. What's life like for them?
Terrible, absolutely terrible. Their shops are sacked. The clubs, German Canadian clubs, are closed down. And in fact, many of the people who are former citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so it's not just Germans, but it's Ukrainians and Austrians, are interned. 8,000 internees in the First World War, just of those European groups. Ukrainians, for instance, there were 24 camps set up in Alberta, and they were shipped off to these camps and had a totally wretched war building highways.
Do you still see an impact of that time when you see modern day Canada?
Well, I think now we're very conscious of the danger of stereotyping any group, and we're very conscious of the danger of just assuming where people's loyalties lie. On the other hand, I want to say that you also have to take yourself back to 1914 and understand why there was such paranoia, why there was such fear. It was a real there was a real danger that, in fact, Germans were trying to agitate among German Americans, because of course America was not in the war till much, much later, to invade Canada and to mobilize a unit within the United States. And in fact, there were sort of various sort of crazy conspiracies that way. There was a reason why Ukrainians and Germans and other Canadians who came from those countries were mistreated. And it wasn't just racism. There was at the time good reason to fear they might turn against their new country.
And so fast forward a little bit to 1917, because that's when we start conscription. Every guy from 20 to 45, I think, has to go. Prime Minister Borden does this. What's his calculation in introducing conscription?
There was such pressure from Europe. By then, so many of the Canadian soldiers had spent months in the trenches. They desperately needed to be relieved. And they knew that there were Canadians who hadn't volunteered, that in fact, they needed more men there, and there were no more volunteers to be had. So Borden realized that he had to find more forces, but he also understood that this was going to be very, very challenging for national unity. Because although Quebecers, in fact, in the very early weeks had shown great enthusiasm for the war, some Quebecers, there were 1,000 volunteers in that first draft, that first force that went to Europe. Quebecers were saying, why are we fighting Britain's wars? And, you know, this isn't our battle, and we're not supporters. We are Canadians, we are not British. And so he knew it was going to be very challenging, but he also knew that the pressure from English Canada to find more forces was just irresistible.
It's interesting that you say that Canadians were asking those questions. Why are we going to fight someone else's war? Because it's the kinds of questions we're still asking today many times.
Yes, I mean, I think now, you know, there is such resistance to armed combat because we know the costs of it. Although one of the saddest things when you look at the newspapers from this period is the lists of long, long, long lists of casualties. You look at it and you think, how can so many people be being killed? But what you don't see today, what you didn't see back then was the videos of what was happening in the trenches and just how brutal it was.
It's interesting that you say that. I was at my kid's school the other day and walked, you know, down the hallway, and there's the list of all the soldiers who'd gone to that school who died. And we forget just how many Canadians were going over there and the numbers of people that were dying. It's just, it blows your mind.
Well, you can see it actually. So many small towns in Canada have war memorials that serve for both the First and the Second World War. And the numbers for the First World War are usually 3 or 4 times larger than the numbers killed in the Second World War.
So as conscription is taking place in this country, there are those who are opposed to conscription. How are they characterized? Are they seen as just anti-war?
Yes, they're seen as unpatriotic. They're seen as not really British. But there's greater tolerance for them in Canada than there was in Britain, where objectors, conscientious objectors, conchies, were really despised.
One of the things that you write about in the Massey murder, and I find so interesting, is about the role of women and how Canadian women's attitudes, behaviors changed during the war. Women's rights are bubbling to the surface at this time in this country. To the extent the franchise to women. How does that sort of intersect with the First World War?
What the First World War did was accelerate the movement to bring women into public life. Although there was a very strong suffrage campaign led out west by people like Nellie McClung before the First World War, it hadn't really sort of got much traction. But as soon as men start being shipped across the Atlantic to fight, women have to take their jobs, and women start working in factories, women start working in munitions plants. They have to get special permission, and there's tremendous resistance, you know, that this was going to be damaging to their health, but that soon disappears when just sheer economic need forces it. But once women stop being in domestic service and move into the paid workforce and realize that they want to have a role in public life, this enormously increases the demand for the vote, for suffrage. And there's no turning back.
And there's also within this, it's not just an economic thing, like go do a new job, get out of the house. I mean, there's this whole social aspect that changes for women. Tell me about how it changes.
Getting out of the house is huge. I mean, getting out of the house means actually mingling with other women in sort of public places, sharing experiences, and refusing to be stereotyped as, sort of helpless and vulnerable. And women realized that they had played an enormous role in building this country, and they wanted they wanted to say in how it was run. One of the extraordinary things about the First World War is Canada has a population of 8 million. Over 600,000 Canadians go abroad to fight, including 3,000 women, the nurses who went. And that is a vast number, a vast percentage. Every family in Canada was touched by the First World War. They knew somebody who was fighting. They knew one of the many people who were killed. 39% of those who went were killed or wounded. The numbers are mind-boggling. And women wanted, there was a surge of demand that this is a massacre. We want to know what's happening. We want to have a say in this.
And is this across the different classes of women?
No, it's always a middle-class movement, a demand for suffrage, because you have to be articulate and you have to be tough and you have to stand up to men. And, generally that's going to be women who already have a fair degree of a sense of entitlement.
Tell me about some of these women. You talk about Nellie McClung. I think we're all familiar with them, but in Eastern Canada, who are some of the women that are sort of key to the suffragette movement?
There were many. Actually, one of the things I find incredible is that they are hardly remembered. One of the extraordinary things about the women's suffrage movement is that it was a collective. It was we know about the women out west, like Nellie McClung, but the ones within Canada, within Ontario, Denison or others, they worked within the system largely. They weren't doing what the British suffragettes were doing at this point, which was being much more vocal and much more aggressive in their tactics. Canadian suffrage advocates just kept quietly demanding their
Very
place.
Canadian.
Very Canadian.
All right, so we've pointed out some of the divisions within Canadian society during the war. Overall, Charlotte Gray, I mean, would you say that our country had a unity to it despite those differences and stuff?
Are you asking me if Canada was united during the First World War?
I am.
The rift between English and French Canada widened enormously. It became a chasm. It was incredibly damaging when Borden did introduce conscription. There were riots in Quebec City, and essentially the Conservative Party lost for half a century that part of Canada. There was a unity at the start of the war. By the end, the fault lines of Canada had really appeared.
So we have these cleavages. The war ends in 1918. Those who obviously survived come home. Paint me a picture of that Canada then.
A Canada that has changed so dramatically while those men were in Europe. A Canada where the women are no longer prepared to stay within the domestic sphere, either as sort of mistress of the house or as domestic servants. I mean, the servant problem becomes enormous in the columns of newspapers because middle-class women can't find women to work in their kitchens. All those women are now demanding factory jobs, clerical jobs, jobs in the department stores. The men come home, there aren't enough jobs for them. They've had this horrendous experience, and in fact, very few provisions have been made for them when they're demobilized. And so you very quickly get the growth of a powerful labor movement that you see, for example, in the Winnipeg General Strike the year later.
And so as the men and women come home from war, they almost seem to come home to a foreign country in a way, one that they certainly weren't familiar with. How do they feel about this?
As far as I know, they felt traumatized for a long time. I mean, they're still recovering from their extraordinary and experiences. They've lost most of their friends. They've lost their brothers. It's been appalling. And they come home, there aren't, for the Second World War, there were many more provisions in terms of housing, in terms of education allowances, to ease that transition back into civilian life. Very little of that existed after the First World War. And one of the things I find most fascinating about Canada is how quickly it turned its back on what had happened, on the traumas of those dreadful 4 years. And Canada in the 1920s, it's as though it wanted to just shed that sense of duty, that sense of morality that had taken so many men into war and then had proven to be pretty threadbare when it got to fighting. And suddenly, you know, it's speakeasies, it's flap addresses, and the old conventions have gone. Canada changes dramatically, but many of those men never recover.
And what happens to the people that were interned during the war? I mean, what are their attitudes come 1918?
For many of them, it was traumatic again, you know, that they felt embarrassed and scarred, because it was like going to prison. They hadn't done anything wrong, but they were thought to have the potential to do something wrong. And they never felt, you can read letters actually from the Ukrainian internees, where they never really trust Canada again.
And we began our conversation talking about our attitudes towards Britain, 1913, 1914. November 1918, we come home. What are our attitudes toward Great Britain? How do they shift during the war, and what do we come out with it?
Well, by 1918, many people have realized at every level of society, you know, that this has been a war of stalemates, conducted on a relatively small battlefield, just sort of 2 or 3 months of boredom followed by horrendous battles. And people are saying, what was the point? And particularly for Canadians, they knew that they had sacrificed an awful lot of men, and proportionately more than Britain had. More colonial troops, whether they were New Zealanders, Australians, or Canadians, had died, proportionate to their numbers, fighting, than British. And there was a sense of resentment. There was a sense that even though Prime Minister Lloyd George of England had said that the Canadians were such good fighters, they were the shock troops, were they being used as cannon fodder? And so the gap between Britain and its colonies began to widen. And that was another aspect of what was happening in the 1920s. A greater sense of Canadian nationalism, a greater sense that this was a country that was more than just a sort of a bunch of foot soldiers in the service of empire. This was a country that was itself. It had its own coherence, its own integrity, and it didn't have to automatically jump when Britain said jump.
And how is the world, so Canada is sort of, you know, negotiating its new identity. We're trying to figure out what that is and standing on our own 2 feet a little more, maybe. How's the rest of the world looking at Canada at this time?
It's still a colony.
Quite differently than we see ourselves.
The rest of the world still saw Canada as incredibly British. I mean, it's still, you know, adhered to the monarchy. It's still, until 1931, it still conducted its own, it still left its foreign policy to, mainly to Britain, and it still stayed very British, because in fact most people here continued to speak with English accents, or Scottish, or from somewhere in Britain. That's at that stage where all the immigrants were coming from.
As many people still do in Canada.
As many people still do.
So here we are, 2014. We're going to be having a lot of discussions about World War I throughout our summer. What role do you think, 100 years later, did the Great War have in shaping who we are today?
I think it had an enormous role. I don't particularly like the cliche, Canada came of age in Vimy, although the Canadian forces there were extraordinarily effective, and it was the first time we saw the great General Arthur Currie leading the Canadians and showing that, you know, this guy who had not been to British public school or Sandhurst or through any of the mills of the British officer class this Canadian proved to be a much better officer than many of the British officers who up to then had been commanding the Canadian troops. So Vimy was important. I think what was more important was that the war triggered a whole lot of changes on Canadian soil, whether it was the distrust of the class system, whether it was the new roles for women, whether it was a much bigger understanding that Canada could start thinking of itself as its own country. I think that the main effect of the First World War was that it was a dividing line, that by now, we are more than half a century away from Confederation, and it's time we started acting like a country.
Thank you for coming in. It was a good history lesson. Thanks. I was saying before we started taping that we didn't hear a lot about how the women's movement changed during the war, so thank you for explaining all of this to us.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.